The authors of a book called How Democracies Die. This is Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. They were on CNN talking about some of what they've seen that looks like it might be leading into increased political violence and possibly more coup attempts. So I want to show you a little bit of that interview. Let's jump into that.
When we wrote How Democracies Die 4 years ago, we were worried about the Republican Party because they allowed Donald Trump to be elected. They sort of dropped the ball and failed to protect our democracy from an authoritarian demagogue. But we did not expect that the entire Republican Party would evolve into an anti-democratic force. And that's where they are today. The entire Republican Party leadership, with a small handful of exceptions, is now no longer willing to accept electoral defeat. And democracy can't survive, cannot survive, if one major party can't accept defeat, can't lose.
And look, that point that they made, that it's really about the fact that so many in the Republican Party have supported the claims of the big lie, have refused to admit what January 6th was. So few did. That is like the scariest part. It's not that there are millions of Americans willing to potentially kill someone for Trump, although I'm very worried about that. That isn't necessarily enough to overthrow democracy based on the historical analysis they've shown of democracies that have failed and those which have survived. It's when the party goes along with it. And that is very much what we've seen. And it didn't necessarily have to go that way. I will point out, as I have many times, in the initial hours of January 6th, even up to a couple days later, there were a lot of Republican elected officials who were trying to distance themselves, criticizing Donald Trump openly. And then they learned their lesson and they realized, oh, that wasn't a line that we're not supposed to cross. The base is gonna stick with him. They're not horrified by this. Well, all aboard the coup train, because I don't want to be kicked out of the party. And so JR, that's what I'm worried about.
Yeah, it's when your party is full of people who have zero principles, they'll float whatever direction that they're blown in. That's just how it is. And they're willing to follow a guy who, no matter how many discouraging facts come in his face, he pushes right through. And like, well, I guess we'll stop pushing. You know, I think Chuck Grassley's the latest. After he had his event in Iowa, Chuck Grassley was criticizing him since before January 6th, but then specifically after January 6th. And now, oh, he's in Iowa. I got to jump on that train because now I'm running for office. There was articles where other elected officials, other Republicans, said, well, Chuck Grassley, he announced that he's running for re-election, so of course now he is switching what he's saying. Not realizing that's an open admission that as long as you're running for office, your principles don't mean anything. He had principles for a while, now he's running for re-election, so therefore those principles have been completely flipped on their heads. Were they principles, or was he just lying?
Yeah. No, there's the principle is, I want to stay in power, so whatever comes. And it continues. People are talking about, like, all of these steps are, like, you might take note of some, you might ignore others, but they are a part of what potentially in future years could be a gigantic problem. And that slow motion coup is what they address in this next video.
Interesting is that there have been other events like this in other countries. France in 1934, there was an attack on the parliament. The police fought the right-wing radicals off in that case, but 6 years later, democracy died in France. And part of it was there was an investigation, there was a committee that investigated that attack, and it was highly politicized. They never really fully came to terms with it, and this was a harbinger of things to come. Spain in 1981, there was an attempted coup where soldiers came into the parliament as they were counting votes. When transitions of power are always dangerous times. And at that moment, the establishment politicians, the king of Spain, stood up and said this is unacceptable, and Spanish democracy survived. So how mainstream politicians and establishment figures respond to events like this determine our fate. And right now, looking where we are compared to other countries, it's not looking very.
Yeah, I mean, nobody, like, maybe a week after we wouldn't know, after the 6th, but now nobody can deny that the lesson that has been learned on the right is that that was not a bad thing that happened. They might not want to go on record and say, I encouraged people to go because of the immediate like legal implications of that, maybe. But they want to reassure everyone that they support that those are great people, good people, political prisoners. They've been persecuted, all of that. And that should really worry you based on the examples that they're giving.
Yeah, and and we have to see the reality of it, because after that, I think Anderson Cooper then said, that's terrifying, can't believe this. Margaret Brennan on Face the Nation on Sunday, she was talking about the reality of the plans for a potential takeover, or at least trying to subvert democracy to a degree where we at least get your one guy in power again. And she's like, oh my God. When I read that, because I think it was General Milley even said it, she said, oh my God. I was like, really? Yes. And this is where the power they have in this is continuing to make people believe that they are not really trying to do something this drastic, because it hasn't happened before. It only takes one time for it to happen. How many times have a bunch of Trumpers run up into the US Capitol, broke through windows and said they're gonna kill politicians? It didn't happen before January 6th, but it happened on January 6th. So if you said it was gonna happen before January 6th, which some people did, and then we did nothing about it, it happens. So the next step, if we continue to go, hey, I'm worried about transgender bathrooms, I'm worried about making sure Dave Chappelle is protected and all this, you're not thinking about what's actually happening, the reality of actions that are happening behind all the distractions about how you're so aggrieved over these things that mean nothing, They have actual plans in place to make sure that they are never out of power, because now there's enough people that are waking up to the way that they've stayed in power. Now they need to go to the next stage.
Yeah. And think about the politicians who are gonna run and win in 2022. Think about who, when we hit 2024, there are gonna be tons of names that you'll have been hearing about for a year and a half. Like, we were gonna read this graphic from Madison Cawthorn. Madison Cawthorn is gonna sound like Mitch McConnell compared to the people that are gonna get elected and that you're gonna have to deal with. And they are the players that are gonna be influencing whether democracy gets to do an election in 2024.
Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.